Pius VII, separated as he then was from the leaders of the Sacred College, did not think thus on leaving Paris on the 5th of April. Jury now 26, accompanied by Monsieur de Brigaut, the Chamberlain, and Colonel Duresnel, the equerry of the Emperor. He appeared contented with his journey, although on account of the need for horses, he had been obliged to depart after the Emperor, who had gone to Italy for his coronation, and although he had to put up with several checks and delays on the road, which might have been very vexatious to him, he testified his satisfaction at Turin on the 26th of April, Fleuriel the 6th, when he separated from the Emperor. He testified it on the 2nd of May, Fleuriel the 12th. By a brief dated from Parma, to which he added with his own hand, "We pray your majesty to preserve his affection towards us, and to present our salutations to his august consort." He testified it on the 18th of May, Fleuriel the 27th, by a brief dated from Rome, in which, however, he alluded to some difficulties arising out of the affair of the Germanic Concordat. He testified it finally on the 26th of June, Messidor the 7th, when, in a speech which he pronounced in a secret consistory, he recounted his journey and enumerated the benefits which the Emperor had granted to the Church. "We cannot recall," said he, "without a particular feeling of gratitude, the frankness, the politeness, the amenity, and affectionate foresight with which he listened to the wishes that we expressed to him in the language of apostolic liberty, and received the demands that we made to him for the good of the Catholic religion, the glory of the Gallican, and the authority and dignity of the universal church. Doubtless, in many cases, he had obtained only promises, but many things have been done which are the gauge and earnest of what is yet to be performed. On other considerations, he was pleased to have come into France. The merciful God has deigned," said he, "to bestow so many blessings on our journey, that the bishops do not hesitate to affirm that it has contributed more than was thought possible to the spiritual good of the people." Such were the sentiments that the Pope expressed. If it be admitted with Consalvi that the memory and the pen refused to record the humiliations with which Pius VII was so overwhelmed during the whole time of his unhappy sojourn, and if with him he believed that the Pope had need of virtue, moderation, and gentleness to follow the great example of humility shown by the God of whom Pius VII was the vicar here on earth, it must be allowed that his charity towards the Emperor had been truly apostolic. But Pius VII in France, or even on the point of leaving France, was very different from Pius VII at Rome under the influence of the cardinals. Consalvi strove to stir up discord whenever an opportunity presented itself at Milan. The Emperor had, according to his promise, reestablished the Italian Concordat in its full vigor. By a royal decree dated the 8th of June, he had provided in a magnificent manner for the financial organization of the clergy. He had given back their property to the religious orders devoted to education, to the care of the sick, and to missions. He had pensioned the infirm priests. He had reunited in different houses the members of the meditative and mendicant orders, and assured their subsistence to them. He had restored the property of the bishoprics, and endowed those bodies which had no revenues, the chapters, the seminaries, and the vestries. To these last, which had been despoiled, he assigned revenues of from 4 to 9,000 francs. This was infringing on the spiritual powers. The Pope protested in a sharp letter, which Consalvi drew up. "My intention has been to do everything for the best. Am I deceived?" answered the Emperor, and he frankly stated that he had wished to do. "I pray His Holiness," he wrote, "to believe in the desire that I have to see him happy and contented, and in the fixed determination wherein I now am to give him no cause for grief or discontent and affection. I do not wish to have any dispute with the Holy See, nor to give it any cause for complaint. But the cardinals sought a quarrel. Although they gave in about the decree of the 8th of June, they attacked the constitutional law of the kingdom. The introduction of the Napoleonic Code into Italy was the battlefield they chose. They did not shrink from giving any mortification to the emperor and caused the Pope to refuse a dispensation from the marriage, which Jerome Bonaparte, the young brother of Napoleon, had contracted when a minor, and under conditions of secrecy, which at any other time would have rendered it fundamentally void. With an American Protestant at Baltimore against the wish of his mother, they made Rome a place of asylum for all the enemies of the emperor. When war broke out between France and Austria, they showed their real intentions and invited an invasion of the English or Russians when the emperor found himself obliged to occupy Ancona in order to provide for the safety of the troops employed in the kingdom of Naples. They obliged Pius VII on a rumor of defeat of the French forces to write him a threatening letter on the religious question. There was no dispute. But at every moment, the political questions grew more burning. They became intensified when the emperor undertook the conquest of the kingdom of Naples and when Napoleon engaged in that struggle with England in which he fought the mistress of the seas by means of his mastery over the continent. When he answered by the closing of all the ports to the closing of all the ocean, and when he wished to know clearly whether the temporal sovereign of Rome was with or against him. Doubtless he was at the same time not far from thinking that, since he had practically reestablished the empire of the West, he had the right to exercise the same power as the emperors of old. Doubtless he was of the Ghibelline blood, and the slumbering Ghibelline tradition within him was awakened. Doubtless he had believed that on his return from Austerlitz, the Pope would have hastened to offer to him at St. Peter's the crown of that empire which he had just reestablished, and that thus, like the emperors of the Holy Roman Germanic Empire, he would add to the consecration of Paris and Monza, the third consecration of Rome, which would bestow the loftiest investiture upon his Western Empire. But all the obstacles which he experienced would have vanished had he been able to confer privately with Pius VII. And if the Sacred College, whose prisoner the Pope was, had not striven to render the rupture irremediable, and to prevent any personal approaches or direct communication. All this would have been very different had it not been for the Pope's journey to Paris and the Catholic consecration. The emperor would not have had the same confidence in his influence over the Pope, whose power he very wrongly imagined to be absolute like his own. He would have remained in the excellent position in which the Concordat had established him. He would not have been the debtor, but the benefactor of the Roman Church. He would have been able to demand anything from her as regards temporal matters without the Pope being able to reproach him at every moment with having made empty promises. If he had not made an official declaration of Catholicism, he would have been unmoved by a bull of excommunication. As it was, in 3 years they had arrived by incident after incident to open war. But this journey of the Pope across France had produced a considerable movement less in favor of religion than of the Holy See. The Pope had been hitherto unknown in France. It might almost be said ignored. Each Catholic was in touch only with his priest, or at most with his bishop. But now the Pope had appeared as a living and active head of the Church. He had ceased to be a distant and hazy personage and had become a distinct and visible reality. He aroused enthusiasm and left behind him memories. His ultramontane militia, officially abolished, but actively at work and more vigorous than ever, was entrusted to develop them, to construct on them a doctrine and to spread it among the faithful, to teach it in the seminaries. Gallican doctrine, already greatly weakened by the two schisms of the constitutional little churches and mortally wounded by the Concordat, was on the point of being effaced and destroyed. The last of its supporters were those emigrant priests who had raised their protests in vain against the Pope on the subject of the coronation. The Abbé Coulon, who published his A Discourse Against the Coronation of Bonaparte, dedicated to all the friends of justice and honor. The Abbé Blanchard, vicar of Saint Hippolyte, who published The Political and Religious State of France, becomes still more deplorable in consequence of the journey of Pius VII. The Abbé of Saint-Martin, with his brotherly advice. There were a few others perhaps, but how many? An opinion arose which was fomented by the ultramontane priests, and save for a few rare exceptions, the most zealous propagators of it were those whom the emperor thought were the most devoted to his person. As soon as Rome had spoken, from the time when the Pope, making use of his spiritual arms for his temporal interests, had hurled his censures against him who had even begged to be anointed with the holy oil and had thrown in his hands, from that time everything by by which Napoleon had expected to benefit in the consecration turned against him, and those very persons whom he had hoped to win over and conquer thereby, whose fidelity he had accordingly believed to be assured, became his worst enemies. It even seemed to some that since Napoleon had shown such monstrous ingratitude, the Pope who had given had the right also to take away, so that if the imperial power was apparently unshaken by the thunders of the Vatican, there actually arose around it an atmosphere of disaffection, a spirit of opposition, and a sullen conspiracy for its destruction, by which all the enemies of the revolution, Frenchmen or foreigners, were to profit alike.